G'day. Australia is home to stunning landscapes, unique wildlife and a rich mix of cultures. But do you know that the Australian English spoken here can be just as diverse? You might think that Australian English is just that classic Australian accent, but there's a little bit more to it than that. So let's dive in and find out whether Australia has dialects or not. So what exactly do we mean by dialects? We could say that a dialect isn't just about accent, it's about regional variations in pronunciation, vocabulary and grammar. While these differences are not as pronounced in Australia as in other English-speaking countries, they're definitely there. So what are these subtle differences? Let's talk about three key areas. First of all, the broad Australian accent. This is the one most people think of when they imagine the Crocodile Dundee-like Aussie accent, or that of Steve Irwin. It's characterised by a more nasal quality and some classic Australian slang, like crikey and struth. My own accent veers towards broad. Next, we have the general Australian accent. This is what you'll hear from most Australians. It's the standard everyday accent. And then there's the cultivated Australian accent, which sounds decidedly more British. It's less common today, but was historically associated with the upper class. These accents can be found across the country, but they don't necessarily map neatly onto specific regions. Instead, they're more about social class and personal identity. Dig a little deeper and one will notice that there are indeed regional differences in how certain words are pronounced or used. These have often been either overlooked or not noticed. In fact, 50 years ago, if you were to ask a linguist about differences in pronunciation between different parts of Australia, they probably would have told you that they don't exist and that Australian English is almost completely uniform. For decades, it has been a common perception of linguists and laity alike that there are no such things as Australian dialects. However, more recent studies are starting to prove this perception to be flawed. Lexical studies have shown the existence of four major lexical usage dialect areas in Australia. These are the following. 1. Southwestern Australia. 2. South Central, which is pretty much South Australia. 3. The North East, including Queensland and the greater part of New South Wales. And 4. The South East, which includes Victoria and Tasmania. These areas correspond fairly well to minor phonetic differences which seem to radiate out from the major cities in each state. The differences are generally very slight. Australia doesn't have strong regional dialects like the United Kingdom, but clear regional patterns are starting to emerge in the speech of people from the cities of Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide and Perth. Take Melbourne, for example. Here you may hear some subtle differences in the way some words are pronounced compared to Sydney or Perth. Words that have L in them tend to change it to Al, so that Melbourne becomes Malvern. The opposite can also happen. Albon can be said Elbon. South Australians are said to have developed their own accent. For example, the words no and don't tend to sound like no and don't. Another South Australian quirk is their pronunciation of dance rather than dance, as it's said in other parts of Australia. People drink from bubblers instead of water fountains. South Aussies also tend to vocalise the L in words like school and milk, almost in Cockney style. In New South Wales and Queensland, you'll hear the word port used to describe a school bag. You might also hear the words lobby or a clawchie instead of yabby. Generally speaking, these northeastern Australians tend to say school and pool. They'll also be more likely to speak in a broader accent, particularly if they come from a rural area. These are subtle differences, but they are there. Add to all that the famous Aussie penchant for abbreviations like Arvo for afternoon, Postie for postman, and Servo for service station, These are common across the entire country and may vary in different states. For example, Queenslanders might also say arvy, and South Australians might also say afty for afternoon. Another important aspect is the influence from the indigenous languages of Australia. Some regions use Aboriginal words more than others. One can see this in place names and names for wildlife, but particularly in everyday slang. An interesting example of this is the slang word for cigarette, which varies from dart and durry in New South Wales and Queensland to booyah in South Australia. So, does Australian English have dialects? Abso-bloody-lutely. They may not be as strong as in other English-speaking countries, but the subtle differences in accent, vocabulary and pronunciation show that Australia's linguistic landscape can sometimes be just as diverse as its natural one. For more fascinating insights into languages and dialects, we'll catch you later.